Talking NATO today. Now, you might think, well, gosh, what does that have to do with us? Well, our Prime Minister is involved with the NATO summit happening in the United States at the moment, so it must have some connection with us here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. But what connection exactly? Joining us on the program now is geopolitical analyst for the Democracy Project, Geoffrey Miller. Geoffrey, kia ora, thanks for your time today.
Good morning, Andrew. Thanks for having me on.
Firstly, I mean, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, I think it's, 75 years it's been going. We're a long way from the North Atlantic here in the South Pacific, aren't we?
That's absolutely correct on both counts there, Andrew. 75 years that NATO has been in business, which is quite remarkable, whatever one's opinions are of NATO, which is the West's premier military and political alliance. 75 years, it's a grand old age. It was established in 1949. And it was really designed to confront the Soviet Union and and stop it expanding further. If you recall that the Soviet Union, or then the Warsaw Pact that it formed with countries like Poland, and it was very much on the lookout for other candidates and other countries that it could then bring into its fold, if you like. And NATO was established to stop that, really, because one of the core elements, the bedrock of NATO, is Article 5 of the Washington Treaty that was signed when it was formed in 1949. And Article 5, it's all about collective defense. So if one NATO country is attacked, the whole alliance is attacked, and the whole alliance will respond. And it's incredibly valuable if you think about it, because that's a huge deterrent to anyone who might attack you, to know that they're going to have to not just take on you, but the United States and the whole might of the 32 countries. Now, it was 12 at the founding in 1949.
Now, things have changed, of course, significantly. No longer the Soviet threat, although perhaps as history repeats itself, very much a Russian threat for NATO allies in Europe at the moment. We'll get to that shortly. But firstly, what has changed for NATO? How is it a different organisation now, 75 years on from its founding?
Well, NATO has found its mojo again. There was a time after the end of the Cold War where it seemed that NATO was quite irrelevant, and NATO spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, which you think, why on earth was it in Afghanistan, looking back? After 9/11, but that was because Article 5 was used after 9/11 and was activated. So then NATO tried to find some relevance and something to do, because after the Cold War ended, there was a lot of rapprochement with Russia and working together, and then NATO had a problem. What was it actually there for? So if you go back to the 1990s, people thought, what's the point of NATO? It's irrelevant. So NATO tried to find some relevance by getting involved in Afghanistan after the US invasion in 2001. But we've seemed to have come full circle now, because I mentioned how 1949, this was all about countering Soviet expansion. Well, now, of course, it's all about Russia again, once again. That was the original purpose of NATO, and that's why NATO now is probably more relevant than ever, because it's gone back to its knitting, in a sense, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
And not just a perceived threat, but a real threat now, and not just for Ukraine. I think there's no illusions certainly from NATO members, that if Russia was successful in its so-called military operation in Ukraine, then other borders in Eastern Europe would be under threat. There's a new expansionist, well, perhaps not so new, expansionist Russian ideology. This is a time for NATO to band together.
Indeed, and of course, this is why Sweden and Finland both joined NATO in the last couple of years. Sweden joined officially in March of this year. Finland joined last year, because they see it as incredibly valuable, incredibly attractive to have the umbrella of NATO's protection, to have that collective defence.
Especially for Finland having such a long border with Russia, of course. And in some ways, some people would say that the possibility of Ukraine becoming a NATO member, that was one of the causal factors, or at least one of the excuses that Russia had for the Ukrainian invasion in the first place. What's your thoughts?
Indeed, and Russia has a great fear of NATO expansion. They always have had that, and after the Cold War, the Russian side certainly still had a great fear of NATO, while the NATO side, Western countries, tried to work with Russia.
Yep.
NATO kept coming back to NATO. So, yes, it's more relevant than ever, and both sides. And when it comes to Ukraine, certainly Ukraine has been promised membership eventually in NATO,
Yeah.
but not at the moment, not while the war is on. And that's going to be a lingering point of tension when it comes to any peace talks with Ukraine over what happens to the country. Is it going to be allowed into NATO? Because that is, of course, as you said, one of perhaps the motivations why Russia got into the war in the first place, because they don't want Ukraine entering into NATO. They see it as very much as their buffer. That's the Russian point of view. Everyone can have different views on whether that's fair or not, but that's very much the Russian viewpoint, that NATO has got no business being in Ukraine.
Of course, the concern would be if the war in Ukraine, if Russia is successful in their war in Ukraine, then I suppose Poland becomes the buffer, and thereon it continues. However, of course, Poland has been a NATO member for some time. If there was Russian aggression against a current NATO member, this stuff starts to get a bit real.
It does. And I guess this is why this conflict in Ukraine is just so serious, this war in Ukraine. We've had a couple of scares where missiles have hit Polish territory or appeared to have hit Polish territory, if you recall, over the course of this war since it began in 2022. And that always gets a lot of attention, and for good reason, because, in theory, that could then bring in NATO collectively into the war, because at the moment NATO's not involved in the war in Ukraine. NATO countries they're supplying Ukraine with arms and so forth, but because Ukraine is not a member, NATO itself is not involved directly in the war.
There is a lot of talk at the current NATO summit about the Ukrainian situation, but there's another subtext, I suppose, and this is the part where perhaps New Zealand comes in. Not just North Atlantic, but South Pacific and India as well, pushing back against Chinese expansion in different parts of the world. That's in some ways what this NATO conference is actually about.
Yes, Jacinda Ardern attended the NATO summit in Madrid back in 2022, and this was the first time really that New Zealand had been invited to a NATO summit. There was one other exception to that, but it was to do with Afghanistan, and Helen Clark went to a NATO summit way back when, 20 years ago. But apart from that, Jacinda Ardern went along to the NATO summit in 2022, and the theme of that summit was all about China, actually. It seems quite bizarre in hindsight, because we just had the invasion of Ukraine, but NATO had been working on what is called a strategic concept, which is essentially their long-term blueprint. And they had very much turned their attention also to China. So not just Russia, but looking more broadly and looking at countering China. And this is why New Zealand is invited really to NATO summits now. That's happened now for the last 3 years, since 2022. Chris Hipkins went along last year. Now Christopher Luxon is there in Washington, D.C. This time around, because it is all about China and the Indo-Pacific as well now. And this is very interesting because, as you mentioned, I think earlier, New Zealand's very much in the South Pacific, not in the North Atlantic. So this is NATO spreading its wings even further this time, even further than Afghanistan. And China is certainly not happy about this. There's no talk of New Zealand becoming a member. NATO is going to be restricted to the North Atlantic geographically, but New Zealand is now a NATO partner, and that is already quite provocative from the Chinese perspective.
I mean, quite a different response. As you say, this is the third NATO summit, well, consecutive NATO summit that we've been invited to. Quite a different response from our current Prime Minister, from our current government, than the previous governments, more perhaps open to the idea of partnership than previously, Geoffrey?
I think we're seeing a level of continuity here. the previous government, the Labour government, was quite surprisingly open to deeper partnerships with NATO. I say surprisingly because you look at the heritage of the Labour Party, the independent foreign policy,
Yep.
that's not a natural position for them to take. It's more natural for a centre-right government to take, National New Zealand First Act, and certainly they're speeding things up. So Labour did delay a little bit when it came to deepening formal ties between New Zealand and NATO. There's what's called an individually tailored partnership program, or ITPP, and New Zealand had pushed the go slow button on that over the last couple of years. But Winston Peters has signalled that that's going to be wrapped up very soon, so possibly this week, possibly later this year, and so. Yes, the new government is very keen on working together more closely with NATO and stepping up its military spending and just being more in sync, perhaps, with how NATO sees the world and how NATO countries see the world.
Now, it'd be fair to say that our Deputy Prime Minister is more pro-US than perhaps previous governments or previous potential partners in that regard. Probably quite keen to have a closer relationship, not just with NATO, but with the US. Just wanting to talk, though, about some of the differences here, because there's a key difference between having a political or a military association and a trade deal. NATO's very much not a trade deal. In fact, we've got better trade relationships with China than we have with any of the NATO partners in some ways.
That's right. NATO is a political and military alliance. It certainly doesn't do trade deals. So New Zealand has worked on this very hard over the years. New Zealand got very close to signing a free trade deal with the US through the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, but in the end it was no cigar. Donald Trump pulled the US out of that.
Yep.
New Zealand did get a free trade deal with the UK, which is not bad, a fairly weak deal with the EU.
Mm-hmm.
But overall, New Zealand's still very dependent on trade with China.
Yep.
And if China is not happy with New Zealand getting too close to NATO, there's always the geopolitical risk that China decides to punish New Zealand. And NATO is not offering New Zealand any sort of safeguards. This is what perhaps I struggle with when looking at this with NATO, because New Zealand's not getting the benefits of collective defence.
Yep.
But New Zealand is putting itself at risk to some degree from China's response and from response of others. Remember, Russia has a Pacific element to it all as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I think New Zealand leaders probably need to think about this. If New Zealand is going to get closer with NATO, then I think New Zealand probably needs to put more pressure on NATO members to provide New Zealand with greater market access for New Zealand exporters, because I think that's where New Zealand's greatest vulnerability lies, in its trade.
I mean, there are some traditional relationships going back into last century in terms of these are our traditional allies. These are the flags that we've fought alongside in previous wars. We've come to each other's aid and defence, but not necessarily in a trade capacity. You would think that we would be good friends and trade partners with our natural allies. Not necessarily the case in the complexities of the geopolitical world.
That's right. There are a lot of contradictions. You hear a lot of talk about, New Zealand and the US, or New Zealand and European countries are great old partners, and they are. Right, from going back to the two world wars. And yet when it comes to trade, most, not all, I mean, the United Kingdom did give New Zealand a very nice free trade deal a couple of years ago, but most others are just unwilling to accept a large amount of the product that New Zealand produces. The EU free trade deal includes a quota of 10,000 tons of beef, which is really just a couple of large New Zealand farms. So it's not significant, and it's not enough really to shore up New Zealand against that geopolitical risk of, if New Zealand gets too close to NATO in China's view, or in the view of others, then New Zealand could be punished for that by Beijing and left really up the creek, because around a third of New Zealand's exporters do go to the Chinese market every year. So it is something of a mystery, something I think New Zealand policymakers will just need to think more about, how to square the circle between trade and military ties.
And perhaps particularly with the US election, of course, coming up at the end of the year, depending on which way that goes. Of course, it was Donald Trump that pulled us out of a potential Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. And that could also have an impact on the shape and form of NATO as well. But hey, at least we have a seat at the table, Geoffrey, and interesting to see what happens as we move forward. Thanks for your analysis. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Andrew. It's great to be on with you.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.